Good evening all, and welcome. A police officer's job is never easy, let alone when they have to deal with the much darker sides of humanity. Be warned, some of these stories are particularly disturbing. Tread lightly. For now though, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I was 21 and recently became a police officer, and was also recently dumped. So my friend suggested Tinder. As a 21-year-old and new cop, I had the I'm invincible and I can take on anyone mentality. I matched with a very good-looking out-of-my-league female. We chatted and eventually set up a date to meet. She said she had a great open field to look at stars and hang out, and we could meet up at her house. So the night came, and I was excited, and she seemed to be excited when I picked her up. She guided me to the field, and it looked nice. Open space, woods, deer, and other wildlife. In the field, I noticed really dim headlights in the distance. Then, the van started driving towards us and pulled up right in front of us, almost close enough to block me from going forward. I told her to stay in the car and that I would go say hi. I grabbed my flashlight, the one I had in the car, and walked up. In the front driver's side of the van, there was a decently sized man. I asked him what was going on and if he could back up a little bit. He was very polite. He said that he was the owner of the property and said that he didn't mean to scare us. He told me he'd been having trouble with poachers on this property for a while and just wanted to make sure we weren't going to be shooting at anything. I assured him that we only came out to look at some stars and wildlife, and he was perfectly okay with that, and told me to have a nice date and drove away. After that, the girl was texting non-stop. Around an hour later, I saw headlights coming towards us again, this time at a really fast pace. We hopped in the car, and I moved it to a more defensive position. The same man came close enough to almost hit my car. She hopped out of the car at that point and ran towards the guy. I immediately knew I was screwed. I got out and gave them commands to back up and get on the ground. Neither of them complied, obviously. He then proceeded to charge me and knock me over to the ground. Luckily, I was able to get him on his back and get him up, and saw my date grab a metal pipe from the van. She told me they had a gun and to give them all the money in my truck and that I wouldn't get hurt. Of course, with my I'm invincible mentality, I said no. She started to cry and saying that she didn't want to hurt me. He then started to go back towards the car. At that point, I told them I was a cop, drew my concealed firearm and to lay on the ground. After a moment of shock from all of us, they complied. I was able to call 911, tell them my name and badge number, and that I had two at gunpoint and needed backup immediately. I gave our dispatcher the best directions I could to this field while on the phone. They both fled. Again, stupid young cop mentality. I chased him for about 30 seconds and heard 3 loud pops and saw muzzle flash. My invincibility mentality went right out the window. I ran like hell back towards my car and peeled the hell out of there. I went back to the area, the one I picked her up in, called dispatch again, and had officers come to that location. Of course, the first officer to pull me up was my sergeant and my field training officer. Of course, they were both completely understanding and didn't give me any shit about it at all. The most used word was dumbass and stupid rookie. I hopped in their car and went towards the field. The van luckily was still there. I was told to shut my mouth and only come out if they started getting shot at. They cleared the area and started looking in the van. They found meth right on the center console and searched the car. What scared me the most was when my field training officer and sergeant came back to the patrol car, let me out, and told me to come look in the back of the van. Both of them were pale, looked horrified. But there in the back of the van were several knives, duct tape, lighter fluid, and a decent amount of rifle ammunition, handcuffs, and what looked to be dried blood. In the front passenger side, we found an AR-15 style rifle, 2 more handguns, and we called for immediate backup and detectives. When they investigated the blood, it turns out it wasn't blood. The plates had been stolen, and the van was reported stolen. I still get shit about the whole encounter, but luckily, no one got hurt. I will never use online dating again. Ever. I am a 25-year-old Latino male. I live in a large city and am married and have 2 kids. But that's besides the point. It has nothing to do with them. Onto the story. It's really bizarre. I work at a 10-floor building as an armed guard for solely the interior part of the building. I only stay inside because we have other guards at the main entrance that check people in, so I only monitor cameras and conduct patrols whenever I want to by the hour. It's really boring most of the time, which brings me to Reddit, lurking. Anyway, some of the floors in the building are occasionally blocked off for renovations. The floor is either completely demolished, or if it's being completely empty, means that it's my favorite places to go while I'm patrolling. Because no one's allowed to be on those floors except security, contractors, renovations, or the janitors. I leave to do my usual patrols, but before I decide that I need to go to the bathroom. But when I do, the men's room is completely full. So I have my most bright idea. Hey, that floor with the renovations will be completely empty. And because no one gets to go there, it'll be spotless. I think I'll hurry to complete my patrol and get to the restroom. Except it's not empty. I don't find it to be extremely odd, as it's about 10 AM and the elevators still go to this floor. I just think somebody has the same idea I had. So I go to the stall furthest away from this guy and try to do my business. Without trying to gross everyone out, I'm gonna tell you this story like it happened. I dropped my pants and I'm handling business. And as soon as I do, this guy is whispering shit all creepy like. Not completely weird at first, but then it just gets louder and louder. And I hear words like, him, over there, they, and you. I think the dude is trying to get my attention, so I'm sitting here, eyes wide open, glad that I'm already on the john. Still, this guy's whispering stuff like he's possessed. I can't even comfortably use the restroom because this guy's freaking me out. So then I realized something, that from the moment I got in here, until the point, which is about 10 minutes give or take a couple, I don't think I once heard anything giving the impression that this dude is even using the bathroom. So everything told me in my instincts not to look, but I do anyway, towards his feet. And this guy is not even on the bathroom. He's standing straight up whispering. So I completely irrationally noped out of there so that I could radio my entrance guard to inform him of what was going on. I posted myself in the hallway waiting for this guy to come out. 30 minutes passed, and I'd had enough of this. I walked in twice, acting if I was going to wash my hands, and the third time, I'd had enough, so I knock on his door and say, "Security, is everything all good in there?" A completely normal voice responds, "Yeah, I'm fine." I wait about 2 to 3 more minutes, and this dude finally comes out. He asks if someone reported him. I told him no, and that I was using the restroom and he was exhibiting strange behavior, and that he was there for a really long time. He says it was nothing, and I ask for his work badge and get his name and company, and explain that he's not allowed to be on this floor. He says he understands, and that it won't happen again, with a look in his face like I scared him. I really hope not to see him again. I've been a cop since I was 22 years old. I graduated at the top of my class, and I aced all of my exams. As soon as the last sergeant had shaken my hand at graduation, I had a job offer, and I eagerly agreed to fly across the country just so I would be seen as dependable. Even so, nothing that they could have taught me in training would have prepared me for the horror that can stem from living in Vermont. If the freezing temperatures or black bears don't kill you, then there's plenty of other things that will. When I first agreed to take the job as an assistant trainer at the state police barracks in Newport, I thought that it would all be pretty green mountains and delicious maple syrup. But I was wrong. I originally hail from Anaheim, California, and I'm convinced that this frigid wasteland will be the death of me. I've always considered myself a tough chick, but I know now that I was woefully unequipped to handle the things that lurk out there. The call that started my living nightmare should have been a standard domestic abuse case, but instead, it ruined my entire perception of reality. In the 3.5 years that I've been here, I've seen humans and animals frozen to death, lumberjacks squished to death by fallen trees, cars that were totaled after running into a gigantic moose, and timber rattlesnakes that are as mean as any diamondback. I thought those were bad enough encounters, but I wasn't prepared to find myself in a situation that I was utterly unprepared for. I had daydreamed about how to get out of tons of different tricky life-threatening scenarios before, but never had I envisioned myself in one that I straight up couldn't figure out how to handle. I didn't have any paperwork left to do last Sunday, and since I'm field trained, I asked my friend Officer T if I could ride with him on a domestic abuse case that had just come in. His partner had already left for the night, so he readily agreed to take me along as backup. As we threw on our jackets and headed out the snow-dusted patrol cruiser, I felt a flutter of excitement. I hadn't gone out in the field for a few months, and I had been itching for some action, now that most of my recent classes had graduated. I looked over the notes, ingraining into my mind that we needed to speak with a Mr. B, who was the suspected wife-beater. Officer T and I drove for about 15 minutes, eventually finding ourselves on one of those pothole-covered roads that Vermont is famous for. The snow was up our thighs, and even our tactical SUV was having some trouble getting up a few of the icier hills. We cursed our luck at being sent to a residence out in the countryside, especially since it was about 7 p.m. and it was pitch dark out. A concerned neighbor had called us, and when we got to Mrs. F's house to hear her report, the distressed woman told us that there were strange screams coming from the creek area behind the houses. We had been under the impression that the fighting had been occurring inside her neighbor's house, and she said that it had been until about 10 minutes before our arrival. She led us out to her back porch, and sure enough, after stepping through the doorway, we heard the screams. They were very hard to describe. They sounded like a low-pitched version of a frantic woman yelling. Each scream lasted anywhere between 3 to 10 seconds, though it never sounded like it was saying actual words. It was a cry of sheer terror, stuck on an infinite loop, and my adrenaline was pumping so hard I didn't even want to bother knocking on Mr. B's door. Normal protocol dictates that we should go next door and question the suspects, but under circumstances where someone is clearly in trouble, we're allowed to prioritize the public's safety over standard inquiries. We sprinted from the porch, making our way as quickly but carefully as we could towards the sound. Officer T and I heard 2 more screams, which were getting louder as we approached the creek. We were both getting a little unnerved. As we made our way into the woods, we quietly discussed if it could be an animal. The screams of a mountain lion can sound just like those of a distressed woman, and our little flashlights weren't doing much to illuminate the shadow-filled forest. We were finally approaching the creek bed, and we hadn't heard a scream for about 5 minutes. We had begun calling out for somebody to come forward if they were there, or to help lead us to them, but there was no more sound. I began checking for footprints, and there were only ours, and something that looked vaguely deer-like. The powdered snow that we were kicking up was causing a fine sheen of mist-like coverage, but even so, we did a thorough sweep of the area, and hadn't seen any signs of blood or a struggle. Officer T and I were just about to turn back and head for the car, when the air around us erupted into a cacophony of shouting, screaming, and savage howling. We were both startled, and I could see my confusion echoed in his face. I opened my mouth to make sure that he was experiencing the same crazy phenomenon that I was, and then we heard an exact copy of this scream from where we were on the porch. It came from directly behind us, but there was nothing there but an open clearing. Officer T resolutely marched into the woods on the opposite side of the clearing to investigate, and then there was another chunk of silence for several minutes. I didn't even hear his footsteps crunch, and I was starting to get anxious. About 10 minutes later, he emerged from a different direction, and for a split second, I thought I saw his eyes shine red in the beam of my flashlight. I dismissed the thought, knowing that the glint of snow off the light was playing tricks on me. Officer T beckoned me over, but I told him that we needed to get out of there. He looked almost angry for a moment. Then, he crossed the clearing to me. I watched with unease as he plowed awkwardly through the snow, stumbling like he had been drinking. I was about to ask what was wrong with him when an odd cry came from our right, and I nearly screamed out loud. That was the last straw for me. I grabbed Officer T's arms and all, but I dragged him through the snow, keeping a firm grip on his bicep so that he wouldn't stumble again. I was about 60 pounds lighter than him, but my adrenaline was pumping so strongly that I was able to get through the snow and up the hill like it was nothing. Just as we got halfway up to the house, the scream came once again. It was so loud that it seemed to be right next to me, and I frantically shone my flashlight around. There was nothing. In that glacial Vermont forest, there was no glinting of animal eyes, no rustling of bushes, no sound of footfalls, just tense silence. As I frantically traced our steps back to the house, a desperate wail sliced through the air. And it almost sounded like my name. It lasted for about 10 seconds straight, and it was much louder than before. By this time, I was terrified, but I kept my wits about me enough to stop and tell Mrs. F to call us if anything else occurred. She never did call again, and I got us out of there as fast as the cruiser would safely go. I still don't know what was in those woods, but even as an avid outdoors woman, I know no animal makes that kind of wail. One thing in particular which still gives me shivers is how completely silent between the screams it was. That might not seem odd, but during the harsh winters in Vermont, there's still always some type of ambient sound when you're in a forest, even if it's just the lonesome cries of non-migratory crows, or the wind causing bare branches to rub together. There's always something. That night though, even back by Mrs. F's house, away from the source of the wailing, there was no sound. Whenever I bring this up, Officer T just says the same cryptic sentence, and he tells me I should be glad we got out of there alive, because the danger was closer than I knew. I was working in a jail as a detention officer. I had just finished our morning routine of passing single-bladed shaving razors to our medical solitary tank when the control room radios me. The inmates were asking for help because somebody cut themselves. Thinking nothing of it, I casually grab a band-aid and head back to the tank. Once back at the tank, I roll the door and enter the tank. Immediately, the other inmate starts yelling that Mark was losing his shit and to help him. I rush to his cell, which is number 10 of 10 in the tank, and it was at the very end, and across from number 5. I get to his cell, which the door had bars across it running vertically, which you can nearly fit your entire arm through. Now Mark is facing his mirror over the sink, repeatedly pronouncing, "I gotta cut this bitch's name off my neck." To add, he is also holding the single blade from the razor which he broke open. I'm trying to get his attention by saying his name. I had a good rapport with him, so I was hoping it would come in handy. Unluckily for myself though, it did. Mark turns around, blade in hand, makes eye contact with me, and in a single fluid motion, he slices himself from the left ear down to the middle of his throat, all while stating, "I gotta get this name off my neck." Due to the location of the cut, and having nicked his carotid artery, I got hit across the face with arterial spray, which then proceeded to spray all over the walls of his cell as well. After being in shock for a moment as to what happened, I regained my sense and called for backup and called for an ambulance for suicide attempt, even though I fully believe he just wanted his ex's name off his neck. To short it up, now my help arrives. We wrestle Mark to the ground and remove the blade from his grasp and apply pressure to his neck while waiting for the paramedics to get there. Mark gets sent to the North Texas State Hospital of Vernon for the criminally insane, arrives back to jail a few weeks later, and attempts to do the same thing 2 more times. Still has his life, lucky enough for him. A few weeks after, when Mark finally got back on his meds and things were under control, he called me back to his new cell. This time it was to apologize for getting blood on me and to thank me for saving his life. He also wanted to let me know that on a personal level, that he had hepatitis C. He said he was honestly worried that he'd ruined the man's life who'd saved him. I'd already gotten tested, and thankfully, I'm hepatitis C free. But I deeply appreciated the concern that he showed at that point. For him to say that, I really must have meant something. I worked as a crime reporter in the New York City area circa 2010. I had a few very memorable nights. First night out, A guy had committed suicide by jumping off a 30-ish story building, landed headfirst near a playground, luckily at night, and it was a mess. I teamed up with a local newspaper guy, as I was TV, to collect facts. I was full of adrenaline, running around like crazy. The newspaper guy was a veteran of this, and after 20 or so minutes he came back and said he left a note. He was depressed about losing his custody of his kids. He was just a waiter though, nobody important. I can't blame the other reporter in hindsight. You've got to be callous to do the job. And I quit less than a year later. Another thing I witnessed was suicide by the subway. The body was in separate pieces and was taken out in 3 bags. There was a woman who was burned to death in her apartment. Her upper torso literally looked like charred barbecue chicken. She was alive. They wheeled her out. The sound she made struggling to breathe was terrible. To end on a positive note though, I responded to a shooting outside of a barbershop. Tons of cops and a few detectives. We, as in the newspaper guy and I, get our shots. Shell casings, emergency vehicles, street signs, the works. And then a civilian comes up to us and says, "Hey, there are a few drops of blood on the sidewalk over there." I tell a patrolman and point out the spot. In no uncertain terms, he calls me an idiot for showing him a ketchup splotch on the sidewalk. My partner and I follow the splotch, which keeps getting larger and larger, and begins to grow into a boot print, which leads us to a multi-story tenant building. The elevator floor is covered with blood, and the elevator is out of order. It's a hot day, so my partner and I look at each other and resign ourselves to hauling ass up the stairs. We hit the 3rd floor, and the air reeks of pennies. Outside an apartment door, there's a towel, a boot, and a ton of blood. Just as we get there, a patrolman starts jogging down the hall towards us to kick us out. We had just beaten the NYPD to the scene. We got our shots and left. Turns out the guy had been shot in the leg. Rather than wait around for someone to try a second time, he hopped his ass to a family member's house, wrapped the wound, and called himself an ambulance. He was laid up in hospital, but came out fine. I live in the UK, and we got a call to say a guy had been arrested in the early hours for going equipped for theft, and his mother had been into the station to ask about the kids. What kids? He didn't mention kids. I go to the house and shout through the letterbox with no reply. I shout again, and there's a 3-year-old kid that comes to the door. He doesn't have a key, and I ask if he's alone. He says no, that his 18-month-old brother is there with him. 3-year-old and 18-month-old kids alone in a house virtually at night. We use the big red magic key to break down the door and get inside. And oh my god, I'm still haunted by the squalor these kids lived in. Dirty diapers everywhere, takeaway cartons, dirty clothes everywhere. 18-month-old has a diaper that's filled so much it's coming up his back. We get the grandmother to come and collect them, and as we do, I'm looking for a cup to get them a drink and a bit of bread for toast as they've not eaten. The cup has mold growing out of it, and there's nothing except tinned beans. We couldn't even get them a drink of water without risking their health. We get a bottle of water from a nearby shop, and we got the kids away and do a sweep of the house. These poor kids shared a single bed. Their bathroom hadn't been cleaned in years. We go into the dad's bedroom, and he's got cannabis growing, set up in a small tent. This could have been set on fire at any point, and these kids would have perished. We get all of that cleared up and bagged as evidence. I go through the house switching off all the electronic appliances and get to his computer, which is still running. I move the mouse to shut it down, and there are pictures of young children, girls, between the ages of 12 to 13, naked. I've never been so disgusted and angry at one man and the way he lived like that, let alone made his kids lived in that environment. He got a lengthy bail date, lost the kids and lost his house. They live with his grandmother now. They're too good for him, really. I heard the other guy on the beat get dispatched to a well-being check of an elderly lady. After a few minutes, the guy asks for a supervisor. A few minutes later, they dispatch me to the lady's house. I get there, and the supervisor asks me to climb in through an unsecured window at the back of the house, because I am of a smaller stature. I get to the window and tell it's the bedroom. I can hear a loud television in the other room, and I know it's Fox News. I yell out, "Police, does anyone need help?" As I climb through the window, I hear an old raspy voice call, "Here." I run out of the bedroom down the hall to where I heard the voice from. From the living room, I see a lady laying face down in the dining room area. I call out for her. "Mom, did you fall? Are you hurt?" I run to her, but she's not moving. I touch her hand, and it's ice cold. She's dead. She's been dead for a few days. I unlock the door and let the supervisor and other officer in. I tell them I heard a voice, and we need to check the whole house. No one else was in there. I know the TV was on, but I could tell that it was the news, and I heard the voice over it. What the hell did I hear? I'm going to be honest. I'm a bit of a grumpy tomboy, and I never imagined that I would end up with a would-be stalker, especially not with the career I chose. I was a forensic death investigator. Forensic police officers that generally work with the DA's office and/or the medical examiner's office that look into cases of suspicious deaths, homicides, suicides, and accidents. Occasionally, I'd run into people who had a passing interest in what I did because they'd seen CSI or Law & Order a few times. No big deal, right? Wrong. So very, very wrong. It started with a homicide scene I'd been called to at an ungodly hour in the morning, when Mr. Fanboy showed up. He was around his late 30s to early 40s, average height and modestly fit, chattering away with some of the poor unis guarding the scene. Not a big deal. It happens because most people are curious, but then he whips out a camera and starts snapping a few pictures. At that point, I figured he was a really nosy, tone-deaf journalist and decided to give him a polite lecture on how inappropriate it was to take photos of a crime scene, especially when we were getting ready to move the deceased's body. I deleted the pics and sent him on his way, and figured that I'd never see him again. But no! He pops up again a week later at another questionable scene. It doesn't click yet that something is seriously off, until a week after he shows up at yet another scene. This one being a complete county away from the last one. So I worked a major city in Texas, through the medical examiner's office, so we took cases from several surrounding counties, a few thousand square miles. So it was odd that this guy would show up at a rather standard scene on the outer edge of our covered area, even if he was press. I mention it to some co-workers when I get the chance, and they've noticed him hanging around some of their scenes as well. When he showed up again, me and a uniformed officer shake him down and see who the hell he is and why he's got a major hard-on for rubbernecking crime scenes. I'm used to rubberneckers. I get it, people are curious and sometimes a bit morbid when something happens nearby. Once the excitement and newness wears off, they go on about their business. Mr. Fanboy doesn't have a criminal record, not like even speeding or parking tickets. So my superior had a talk with him. Basically explained that he was making everyone nervous, and it looked really shady to just start hanging out at crime scenes. So he disappeared for a couple of weeks, before switching to a new tactic. If he can't hang around the crime scenes, why not hang around the investigators? But of course, only the female ones. Fanboy shows up at one of my favorite dive bars that I frequent because it was near my home, over 30 miles from where I work. I'm a 5'7" woman who doesn't look imposing in the least. My co-workers used to tease me that I looked like I was a kid playing dress up in my uniform. Like most women, I tried to be polite with the guy, who at the time was about 20 years my senior, but declined any offer for a drink. He doesn't take the hint and chats me up with some of the creepiest shit I've ever heard. What's the worst crime scene you've investigated? Have you ever worked on a case where the victim was dismembered? Do you think any murder cases are really about power dynamics and not sexually motivated? So I creep the hell out. Those are things I don't want to talk about with a therapist, much less with a dude who's giving me some seriously murdery vibes. I completely shut him down. I'm not even trying to be polite, and he seems to be a little put off, but not even apologetic in the least. I went home, put my service weapon back on, and called my supervisor to give them a heads up and start a paper trail for the RO. He was served with a cease and desist, and a few days later, I figured that the threat of an RO and trouble with the police would deter him from escalating any further. Not even 24 hours after the cease and desist, he is back to shadowing crime scenes like it's going out of style. At another female investigator's scene, he's getting into an altercation with one of the uniformed officers. He gets slammed with trespassing, obstruction, and a few other charges, but since he has no record, he's let out on bail, and shows up at a scene I'm working on not 3 days later. We get into a scuffle after he breaks one of my guy's noses to get onto the scene. He's not as strong as he looks, but I still ended up with a black eye. He looked worse by the time my partner and I finally get him cuffed. An investigation is opened, and turned up a police scanner and a lot of creepy journals in his car, as well as notes on where I lived and worked, along with info on one of the other female investigators. From what I heard through the grapevine, his mother's house where he was living was creepy as hell. Yeah, I never thought people would be that obsessed with crime scenes, forensics, or the like, that they'd end up going to jail. But here we are. I'm also very aware that he probably had a lot of unsavory things planned for me and or one of my co-workers, which still makes my skin crawl to this day. So creepy forensic fanboy, who was also probably a Dexter wannabe who watched way too much CSI and Bones, if you ever get out of prison, let's not meet again. My older brother did little police work after he got out of the Marine Corps, and in that about 8-month span, he saw 2 suicides happen in real time with his own eyes. The scarier part is that he took me on a little ride along one time, just before we were about to eat lunch. There was construction on a main road, so we took another road that led through a pretty bad part of town. But the second quickest way back to the main town was the main road being bad. I remember a lot of people staring at us, and just as we were about to hit the road back into town, we heard gunshots ring out. He called it in, sirens on, drove to wherever they were, and this was just about a year ago. I was 16, and I wasn't really scared. I knew how to handle a gun if I needed to. We go there where we thought we heard the shots, and there were some people running. He went to get out. Then all I heard were these gunshots going off that seemed right next to me, and then the crackling of a windshield and bullets hitting the car. My brother got hit once in the chest, but thank God he had his Kevlar on. He exchanged fire and hit the assailant twice, knocking him to the ground. What I didn't know at first was that I got hit in the arm. I only noticed when my arm felt tingly, and I looked down and noticed I was bleeding. I stayed calm as best I could and let my brother do his work, and searched around for a first aid kit. He yelled back at me if I was hit, and I said yes, but told him to focus on the assailant. I'm a big military guy, going into the Marine Corps next year. I eventually got my arm bandaged as best I could, and figured out the bullet went all the way through my arm, and it did. Everyone survived. Everyone was okay for the most part, but I'm never doing ride-alongs again. The assailant ended up going to the hospital. He was fine, and I don't remember how many years he got. I am on the police force, and I responded to a semi versus passenger vehicle. I arrived on the scene to a frantic scene. Multiple people are yelling and crying. I try to make sense of things and ask if anyone is injured, and I heard the voice of a parent yelling out. If you've ever heard someone in person yelling for help with fear and panic, you'll never see things the same way again. Medics arrive about the time I show up. They start to treat the lady who obviously has a broken leg. I start to make sense of things and get the driver out of the semi. I ask if he needs medical and he says no. I go to the vehicle to get ID for the lady, who is being combative and not cooperating. I get up to the vehicle where I'm looking for a purse, and I look in the crumpled bit behind the car the lady was in. I see a laptop on the floorboard. From what I can make out, I can also hear the sound of Blue's Clues playing on a video. I moved the laptop, but was not prepared for what I saw next. On the top of the laptop was covered brain matter and blood. An infant was on the floorboard, folded up and mangled. Skull obviously crushed. No car seat. Baby was around 2 years old. Placed in the back seat with a laptop on their lap. The force from being hit from behind sent the baby into the driver's seat, and the laptop screen smushed the child's skull. I have 100% written child restraint law citations since then. Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed tonight's stories. Police stories are always very dark, and I find them incredibly interesting as well. Something that always sticks out to me is when children pass away through negligence, as in the story where the child wasn't wearing the child seat. And as a new parent, that frightens me a lot. So, as a warning to all of you out there, remember to wear your seatbelts and put your children in the seats, even if they complain about it. Much better safe than sorry. But with that gloomy message out the way, thank you everyone so much for listening. Don't forget to drop a like and leave a comment. That's always super nice and really helps me out a bunch. If you're new here, why not subscribe and press the little bell icon for new stories every single night. And if there's a story that you would like to share, feel free to email it to me or post it on my Reddit. Either are fine. I think I'm going to have that special treat I mentioned for you out tomorrow, maybe, or the day after at the very latest. I hope you all like it. I'm very excited for it. You'll have to wait to find out what it is though. Not too long a wait though. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.